Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Southeast Asia Lecture Series sponsored by the Asia Center at Harvard University. I'm Annette Lee Now, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard. It's my tremendous privilege to be welcoming our speaker today, Intan Paramaditha, who joins us from Sydney, where she's currently a Senior Lecturer in Media Studies at Macquarie University. For those familiar with the Indonesian literary scene, Intan Paramaditha requires little introduction. She's not only an activist and a media and film scholar trained at NYU, but an award-winning author whose first novel, The Wandering, or Gentayangan in Indonesian, was longlisted for Australia's Stella Prize and selected by Tempo magazine as best work of literary fiction. The novel was also a recipient of the English Penn Translates Award for the novel's translation by Stephen Epstein, who has also rendered into English a collection of her earlier short stories under the title Apple and Knife. She's also the editor of a powerful collection of Indonesian women's poetry recently published and translated from Indonesian into English under the title Deviant Disciples, Indonesian Women Poets. Among Intan Paramaditha's current projects, she's completing a manuscript on film activism and sexual politics in Indonesia, in addition to co-organizing the Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan and the Feminist Festival at Dallas, whose mission is to discuss and celebrate women's contributions and thought across the Indonesian archipelago. She'll be drawing from her many interests and projects for her presentation today on new directions of feminism in Indonesia. Before we begin, I would like to highlight that Intan Paramaditha's presentation today falls on a date of commemorative importance for Indonesia as April 21st, which is the present date in Indonesia and Australia, is the nation's annual Kartini Day, when the life and legacy of the late 19th and early 20th century writer and educational reformer R.A. Kartini is commonly celebrated, though not always in uniform ways across Indonesia's history, a phenomenon observed in Intan's own scholarship in the past. Before Intan begins her presentation, I'd also like to introduce Lara Norgaard, who is a doctoral student in comparative literature at Harvard. Lara will be assisting us with moderating the question and answer session at the conclusion of our talk. Her research interests include post-dictatorship literatures in Indonesia and Latin America, Latin American and Indonesian cultural exchange, and solidarity movements across the global South. She's also an essayist and an accomplished literary translator. Her work has appeared in publications including Asymptote Journal, Public Books, and the Jakarta Post. Her translation of the novel 24 Hours with Gaspar by the contemporary Indonesian author Sabda Armandio was recently awarded a Penheim translation grant and is forthcoming from Siegel Books this next spring in 2023. Intan's presentation will be around 40 to 50 minutes before we open the floor to questions, beginning with a first round from Lara as an opening moderator. Because we have a large number of attendees for the event, we ask that you please submit any questions through the Q&A function once the presentation is concluded. We will be recording the presentation and the Q&A and linking the presentation through the Harvard Asia Center website for those interested in reviewing a recording in the future. Thank you and welcome to Intan.
Thank you so much, Lara, Annette, Jorge, and Harvard University Asia Center for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I would like to thank those of you who have signed up to join this lecture. I know that some of you are located in Indonesia, and this is very early there, so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So I am currently at home in Gadigal land, or Sydney, and I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this presentation starts with a question. What does Indonesian feminism look like today? There is no singular version of Indonesian feminism, although we can identify that certain versions of feminism tend to be more visible than others. Some scholars interested in post-Suharto or post-authoritarian Indonesia might have focused on liberal feminism, characterized by the public discourses of women's rights, equality, freedom of expression, and authority of the body in the early 2000s. Some might have focused on Islamic feminism and how women struggle for authority within Islamic organizations and networks. This lecture is not an attempt to give a comprehensive view of feminisms in Indonesia. Rather, I draw on my experience being part of a collective and a larger network of feminist culture activism to demonstrate that we are witnessing a new direction of feminism in Indonesia, which I call the trans-archipelagic decolonial feminist trajectory. This feminist strain is not part of the mainstream national imagination, but some collectives have been nurturing feminist spaces that connect women across the archipelago by being critical of colonialism, capitalism, and racism. In these spaces, women discuss feminist solidarity that is built not on erasure, but an awareness of difference and borders. Before I continue, I will say a few things about myself and how my position is implicated in this discussion of feminism. So I'm an academic, but I'm also an author, a short story writer, and a novelist. When I was invited to give a lecture, I was asked that perhaps I could talk about the Indonesian literary landscape that I'm part of. Maybe I can say just in one word, the Indonesian literary landscape has long been embedded in patriarchal structures. And this is actually the reason why I seek refuge by connecting with other women in a feminist collective. So this is the story of how I learn from a space that has provided me with a community, a home, but it's not a comfort zone, and I will tell you why. I was born in Bandung and raised in Jakarta, which means that I was privileged with education and access due to my location being at the center. I benefited from the hegemony of Java in the New Order period. At the age of 25, I received a scholarship to do my master's degree in the United States. I lived in the US for about a decade to do my PhD and to teach, and I have been working as an academic in Australia since 2016. So you see, there's a lot of mobility there, and with my mobility, I encounter different forms of coloniality as a brown woman from the global South. However, this fluid movement, the ability to move back and forth between the global South and the global North, has provided me with access to knowledge production and feminist debates, which are unfortunately still centered in the global North. So when I engage and collaborate with other feminists in Indonesia, I need to be cautious of this privileged position. Even though I still experience epistemic violence, with my knowledge being invalidated in Indonesia, I still need to acknowledge difference and the politics of location within our feminist network. This is why the archipelago or the Nusantara is an important reference, along with the borders within it. So let me share my screen now. So in this lecture, I will first talk about the historical context of feminism in Indonesia, and I will explain what I mean by trans-archipelagic decolonial feminist trajectory. I will draw some samples based on encounters facilitated by my collective, Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, or the School of Women's Thought, which aims at creating intervention in the processes of knowledge production that marginalizes women. My focus is on feminists across the archipelago that we have worked with and learned from. And then I will end this lecture with some feminist reflections about Indonesian feminism and how it can contribute to the larger discourses of feminism today. So one thing that we need to acknowledge is that feminisms in Indonesia today are shaped by the history of erasure, and that we have to live with the repercussions of ruptures in our feminist genealogy. We know that the victory of the New Order regime under General Suharto in 1965, supported by the United States, was marked by the destruction of an organized political women's movement. In 1963, Gerwani, or the Indonesian Women's Movement, was one of the world's largest women's organizations with a membership of some 1.5 million women. Affiliated to the Indonesian Communist Party, Gerwani was known for their focus on the issues of gender, labor, and family with an anti-imperialist perspective. In 1967, the organization was disbanded, followed by the stigmatization and imprisonment of leftist women. Following the destruction of this influential feminist organization, Suharto regulated women by discouraging their participation in politics and institutionalized their roles within organizations that framed women as appendages of their husbands, with an emphasis on women's domestic skills and their roles in maintaining the harmony between the family and the state, as well as between the private and the public sphere. This process is what Julia Suryakusuma calls state Ibuism, or state motherism. The ideal woman was encapsulated in the figure of the Ibu, or mother, which within the New Order framework was a mixture of the bourgeois idea of domesticity and the elite Javanese notion of motherhood. Despite Suharto's claim for diversity in the archipelago, in public school textbooks, the mother was visualized as the Javanese woman with a hairband and a kabaya. You can see the image here. And this is the image that many women in the eastern part of Indonesia could not identify with. Feminism during the New Order. With erasure and rupture, Indonesian women had to grapple with limited spaces in the public sphere. Indonesian feminists during the Suharto period had to go undercover or stay low-key in NGOs and study groups. Feminists who left an important legacy during the New Order often had to navigate through bureaucratic institutions and strategically frame women's struggle within the rhetoric of developmentalism. An example of feminism that operated in small spaces or cracks within the New Order structures can be found in the work of Saparina Sadli. She co-founded Komnas Perempuan, or the National Commission on Violence Against Women, and the University of Indonesia's Department of Women's Studies, which was the first of its kind in Indonesia. Saparina Sadli's writings in the 80s and early 90s display a critique of patriarchal structure. She criticizes the idealization of motherhood as a prevalent norm that led to the confinement of women in the domestic sphere. However, she does this by engaging with a developmentalist paradigm. For instance, she proposes that women be viewed as the subject and not just the object of development, and then there should be a balance between career and family so that women can be an air quote equal partner to men. Saparina Sadli's negotiation, navigating between university and state bureaucracies, helped her maintain strategic position to push for a feminist agenda throughout the 90s. Her roles in the development of women's studies in Indonesia and in pushing for law reforms for victims of sexual violence have been highly influential. And in this case, her position was quite similar to another feminist, Tuti Herati, who supported cultural activism and women artists, often through the funding that she gained from her entrepreneurial endeavors. There are some similarities between these two feminists. Both Saparina Sadli and Tuti Herati came from a privileged Javanese family based in Jakarta, and both were highly educated. They were cosmopolitan in terms of worldview and influences. After the political reform or Reformasi in 1998, the word feminism circulated in public, especially with the high media visibility of feminist group Suara Ibu Peduli, or the voice of concerned mothers. The group took to the streets to protest Suharto's policies and supported the student movement. In the early 2000s, both Indonesian and international media also put a spotlight on a group of women writers such as Ayu Utami, Fira Basuki, and Jenar Maisa Ayu for breaking the New Order restrictions and taboos surrounding gender and sexuality through their overt writings about sex and the autonomy of the female body. Liberal feminism, with its emphasis on individual rights, equality, freedom of expression, and bodily autonomy, permeated in the public sphere as a dominant discourse, represented by high-profile urban feminists such as writer Ayu Utami, Gadis Arifia, academic and activist from Suara Ibu Peduli, or the Voice of Concerned Mothers, and she was also the co-founder of Jurnal Perempuan, or the first women's journal in Indonesia. And later in the film scene, there's director Nia Dinata, who was acclaimed for her film that criticized the polygamy phenomenon, Berbagi Suami, or Love for Share. The liberal discourse became the center of attention among Western academics who often studied post-authoritarian Indonesia via contacts with liberal groups such as Komunitas Utan Kayu, or Salihara, and Jaringan Islam Liberal, or Islamic liberal networks. Scholars have also paid attention to Islamic feminism and underlined women's struggles within male-dominated Islamic organizations. KUPI, or the Indonesian Congress of Women Ulamas, was organized to foreground the voices of women ulamas, women Islamic scholars, as authority figures who issued important feminist fatwas regarding various matters, from violence against women to environmental issues. A common challenge that brings secular feminists closer to Islamic feminists in the last 2 decades has been the rise of conservative Islam. Women's activism also emerged from conservative groups. They claimed themselves as pro-family and anti-feminist and rejected the anti-sexual violence bill, which has recently become law. In another direction, in the past 10 years, we have also seen the increasing neoliberalization of feminism. This feminist trend highlights women as agents of entrepreneurial freedom, which aligns with President Joko Widodo's neoliberal policies. Jokowi's former minister, entrepreneur Susi Pujiastuti, and you can see her image on the top left corner, exemplified this brand of feminism, blending entrepreneurial skills, individual disciplines, and feminist Neoliberal feminist language informs creative expressions of the creatives, people working in the creative industry, celebrities and influencers. They frame feminism as a tool to break the glass ceiling and gain individual success. With the government's increased investment in creative economy, we see more festivals such as Idea Fest. You can see on the right there. And these festivals present creative industry, neoliberal ethos, and activism on the same table. So these feminist trajectories continue to exist. And based on this very general map of post-authoritarian feminisms, we can see that highly visible feminist voices and movements have been largely centered or rooted in Java, with prominent organizations and feminist thinkers being based in Jakarta or other major cities in the island of Java. And today I'm going to focus on a rather different direction, small, but hopefully promising. So what is emerging now is a new direction of feminism that is not part of the mainstream public culture, but is growing strong among some feminist collectives. I call this new direction a trans-archipelagic decolonial feminism. In discussing this direction, my scope is limited to feminist cultural activism, a specific site within the feminist movement in which collectives use culture as a site for political intervention. Individuals involved in feminist cultural activisms are writers, artists, performers, filmmakers, and musicians, but many of them connect themselves with networks of human rights activists, labor activists, as well as feminist academics. Trans-archipelagic decolonial feminism in Indonesia operates based on two main frames. First, feminists create efforts to expand meeting spaces for women across the archipelago through the use of digital technology. Second, decolonial thinking and questions complicate these feminist projects and affiliations, resulting in a more critical view of the archipelago or Nusantara as an orientation. So I will discuss these two frames, the archipelago frame and the decolonial frame, while introducing some feminist initiatives. First, the Nusantara or archipelago frame. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, many artists and activists turned to virtual meetings and public discussions, and therefore opportunities for women to meet, women from different geographical locations to meet online increased significantly. However, technologically supported virtual spaces had emerged a few years before the pandemic. For instance, the simple WhatsApp technology was used as a meeting space to create and maintain connection. Here are some collectives and organizations of women in arts and culture that are politically conscious of the archipelago frame, or the need to transcend distance between islands and use technology to overcome geographical challenges. The first is Puan Seni, the Association of Women Art Workers. Puan Seni started as a network in 2015 called Jaringan Seni Perempuan, or the Art Network for Women, and they became an official association in 2021. They are concerned with the lack of support in the arts for women and the inequality of access for women creators outside Java. They organized regular discussions on Zoom, which became more often during the pandemic, and they used the WhatsApp group as a medium for discussion and information exchange among members. So there has been research about how WhatsApp or Telegram applications have been used by conservative groups to disseminate ideas. What we see here is that this kind of application, the WhatsApp especially, has been used to strengthen the feminist networks to transcend borders. The next one that I would like to talk about briefly is the organization Paratas. This is the acronym of Perempuan Lintas Batas, although Paratas also means hackers. The literal translation is women crossing boundaries. Founded in 2017, it focuses on building feminist solidarity among women art workers with an intersectional perspective to, quote, expose the plurality of women's subjectivities that cross and disrupt borders between nations, race, ethnicities, class, sexualities, religions, disabilities, end quote. This is from their website. The paradigm echoes Chandra Talpade Mohanty's idea of feminism without borders, and there's a clear rejection of the neoliberalization of arts and creativity that's more prevalent under the Jokowi administration. Paratas aims to, quote, move towards social transformation and knowledge distribution instead of centralizing in creative industry, productivity-driven or individual career. Paratas members met for the first time in Sulawesi, which could be seen as an effort to the feminist movement, and they have been using online platforms for discussions and dissemination of ideas since then. Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. Sekolah means school. And the literal meaning here is the School of Women's Thought, or SPP. It focuses on one key phrase, knowledge production. Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan is an initiative that intervenes in the processes of knowledge production that marginalize, invalidate, and erase women. It departs from an awareness that we are not lacking women writers, artists, or intellectuals. The problem is that the knowledge produced by women is often devalued at all levels, from the level of adat or traditional custom to the state, from local arts communities to global politics of knowledge production. Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan situates third world women as knowing subjects and engage in epistemic disobedience to the colonial, capitalist, and heteropatriarchal knowledge system. It is called sekolah or school, but it disrupts not through a formal school, but through informal classes, lectures, workshops, and through its annual festival. The feminist festival is called Etalase Pemikiran Perempuan, or just Etalase. So this is the collective that I've been working with intensively, although like other women in the arts, I'm also connected to other collectives and networks. So we are all connected. In 2018, before the pandemic, we had our first feminist school using hybrid learning methods, Zoom and face-to-face meetings. Currently, this year, we are organizing a virtual school consisting of 3 modules. The first one is, it focuses on anti-colonial feminist thought. The second module focuses on gender politics in Indonesian arts and culture. And the third one focuses on feminist cultural activism. The school runs from February to June 2022, attended by 24 women from different locations in the archipelago, from Aceh to Papua. And I must also mention some other feminist initiatives, including the Makassar International Writers Festival, which supports literary voices from Eastern Indonesia with a feminist perspective. Perkawanan Perempuan Menulis, or the Women Writers Collective, which aims at creating a virtual feminist literary space to connect women writers in the Nusantara or Archipelago, and Let's Talk, an online space for feminist discussions. Technology played an important part in virtual feminist border crossing, but there were also other factors that helped shape this new direction of feminism. So the first one is technology, but we also have the pluralism movement, or ways of thinking about plural society and diversity that had already started in the 90s and early 2000 among feminist groups. Another influential factor is the global social justice movements that helped amplify local resistance, particularly Black Lives Matter. The interwoven connection between global social justice movements and local resistance heightened the politics of passing the mic. For instance, it increased an awareness among feminist and pro-human rights organizations about the importance of creating more platforms for West Papuan speakers in public events. So it is not just about the story, but who should tell the story, who has the right to tell a particular kind of story. The last one is the discourses of decolonizing feminism. We know that the language of decolonizing traveled fast since the Rhodes Must Fall protest at the University of Cape Town in 2015. Many groups have tried to engage with decolonial thinking as well as indigenous feminism as tools to examine specific structures of oppression in Indonesia and elsewhere. An example of this is the project of West Papuan activist Rode Wanimbo and her colleagues, who created a feminist reading group to decolonize the Bible, and I will talk about that in a moment. But first, let me just move to the decolonial frame. The word Nusantara, or archipelago, is highly contested. It has been used by the state to claim unity and assert territorial authority. And often when Nusantara is evoked, what follows is a seamless, sanitized image of multiculturalism where borders, difference, and friction are flattened or erased. In trans-archipelagic feminist meeting spaces, encounters between feminists from different parts of the archipelago often lead to difficult and uncomfortable questions about one's position. How is one's location and privilege implicated in an unequal power relation? Women within the networks of feminist cultural activism are moving towards solidarity by confronting rather than erasing borders. Therefore, the decolonial frame is an important element in its emphasis on coloniality and knowledge production. In Indonesia, the trans-archipelagic decolonial feminism addresses two forms of coloniality. The first is the Western imperial power that dominates knowledge production, including knowledge about feminism. And second, the political and cultural dominance of another West, in this case, Western Indonesia or Java. In our meetings, we need to constantly address the notion of Javanese cultural superiority and privilege, and its impact on economic and cultural gaps between Eastern and Western Indonesia, including how it legitimized settler colonialism in West Papua. Questions around knowledge production have become more pressing. Who produces the knowledge? For whom is the knowledge? And who benefits from it? These questions frame our discussions of potential feminist collaborations that aim to transcend borders. I am going to discuss some case studies of this new direction of feminism based on encounters facilitated by Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. The first story is Rode Wanimbo. There will be three stories. The first one is Rode Wanimbo. We invited Rode Wanimbo to speak at our Etalase Festival of Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. Rode is the head of the women's department of the Gidi Church, or the Evangelical Church of Indonesia, and she organizes a feminist study group focusing on decolonizing the Bible to create new narratives of faith that challenge colonial, patriarchal interpretation of religion. For us, Rode's activities exemplify the feminist praxis of crossing borders while opening up spaces for both dialogue and discomfort. Here, Rode spoke in a panel entitled, this is the Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan panel. The panel is called Settler Colonialism and Transnational Solidarity. This is the only English language panel that we have so far, because here we also invited speakers from Palestine and Australia to talk about settler colonialism. And let's have a listen. I hope the audio is clear.
So to me, my great-grandparents and the indigenous people around the world, they are the true guardian of this Mother Earth. So when the settler arrived in the land of Papua, they said that sorry, I just want to say this picture. They said that Papuan way of living, it's uncivilized, it's savage, primitive. That's what they said. These people are godless, and our traditional spiritual practices are stigmatized as animism. Our traditional attire viewed as a symbol of poverty and backwardness, and also we were forced to live in a new type of house and setting, and hectares of sago. Sago is a staple food for the people who are living in a coastal area. So hectares of a sago forest in Merauke, for example, replaced by a rice field. And also millions of trees are dried out due to the tailing disposal from the Freeport McMoran, the gold mining, the largest gold mining company in Tembagapura, one of the highland region in Timika. So these are the island of Papua from Sorong to Samarai. The Great Britain and Germany took over the eastern part of the island, and then they got independence in 1975. But while the western part under Dutch colony, so they divided us according to their own interest, just as they did to the African continent. So US, they want to obtain the natural wealth, especially gold, in Mount Nemangkawi, where the Freeport McMoran exists now. So under the President Kennedy administrative, they initiated a New York Agreement on August 1962. To facilitate the transfer of power over West Papua from Netherlands to Indonesia. And then in 1st May of 1963, from UNTEA, United Nations Temporary Executive Authority, to Indonesia. This time was given legitimate to Indonesia to deploy its army troops, police and army in a large number into the island of Papua.
So in this feminist forum, Rode Wanimbo doesn't only focus on economic exploitation. She also underlines how Indonesian settler colonialism operates by invalidating the knowledge of the West Papuan people through racialization and the privileging of Javanese culture, for instance, replacing the sago forest with the rice field. Listening to Rode's story confronts many of us Indonesian feminists whose activities may have benefited from Indonesia's settler colonialism, as well as the transnational connection with other settler colonial states that may have directly or indirectly contributed to the expropriation of and violence in West Papua. Rode Wanimbo has a name for the efforts to create trans-archipelagic connection. She calls it YUM. In Papua, a YUM is a knotted net or woven bag made from wood, fiber, or leaves, symbolizing life and hope. YUM for Rode is a metaphor for how women struggle collectively. It is, quote, an action in weaving liberation and creating hope, end quote. However, trans-archipelagic decolonial connection is not an easy process because we need to recognize frictions. For example, in Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, the initiators, including myself, must acknowledge that most of us grew up and work on the island of Java. And a decolonial lens requires us to interrogate power relation that results from our privileged locations. We need to make sure that we facilitate exchange without falling into the trap of merely inclusion or neoliberal multiculturalism. The next story is Septina Lion, another woman who works within a trans-archipelagic decolonial feminist trajectory. Septina Lion is our collaborator, composer, and ethnomusicologist. She is a participant of our current virtual school, 2022 school, and she helped us organize a music panel at the Etalase Festival last year. Septina's parents were originally from Maluku, but she was born in Merauke, and she has been living there. She has been working with Papuan music. Septina mentioned that she learned to see how her own practice and research should be seen in a more critical way. After several discussion forums facilitated by Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan. In particular, she learned from Papuan feminist scholar Elstineke Rike Katmo, who introduced her to the writing of Linda Tehewai Smith, indigenous scholar from New Zealand, about decolonizing research methodology. So here's Elstineke Rike Katmo. We consider Els our collaborator within the network as well. She spoke about colonialism in the Papuan context at our festival in 2021, and this year we invited her to be one of our school teachers for the anti-colonial feminist thought module. Septina reflected on how the process of learning from Els and the writing of Linda Tehewai Smith encouraged her to question how her Maluku identity is implicated in her research about Papuan music. She continues exploring ethical, non-colonial, and non-capitalist ways of circulating the Papuan knowledge and ideas outside Papua. So here we have connection. We have the trajectory of feminist knowledge connecting Septina Lion, Elstineke Rike Katmo, and also Linda Tehewai Smith, enabled by trans-archipelagic decolonial feminist space. Cosmopolitan decolonial feminist thinking circulates in a way that situates women in the global South as sources of knowledge production. So women we have encountered and collaborated with, Rodewa Nimbo, Septina Lion, and Elstina Rica, just to name a few, taught us to keep asking the critical questions of who to learn from and how to listen as ways of creating intervention in knowledge production. For me personally, as a writer and scholar, these encounters and collaborations inspired me to disrupt Indonesian feminist genealogy and global feminist history. And one way to do this was to work with my collective and incorporate the work of feminist theologian from Minahasa, Sulawesi, Mariana Katopo in our syllabus. Together with the school participants, we situate her in her anti-colonial, anti-racist feminist thinking within the larger landscape of global feminist thought. Now, this is the last story about Mariana Katopo. Studying Mariana Katopo collectively for us is a way of decentering Java-based feminism and interrogating Western knowledge production. Mariana Katopo was born in Minahasa, Sulawesi. She published her book, Compassionate and Free, An Asian Women's Theology in 1979. So if you situate that within the larger history, this was the time when Nawal el-Saadawi rejected the Western stereotypes of Arab women in The Hidden Face of Eve. Gloria Anzaldúa expressed her affiliation with Third World women in her essay, Speaking in Tongues. And of course, Audre Lorde questioned the master's tools in her essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. So we are questioning the fact that Katopo was not included in the history of global feminisms apart from religious studies or theology, because we found similar anti-colonial and intersectional perspectives between Katopo and other feminist thinkers. Katopo's work is transnational, linking the oppression of women in Indonesia to other parts of Asia, and decolonial. Much like Maria Lugones, she views her gender binary as a colonial construct from the perspective of Asian theology. She writes, forcing people to relate to an all-male trinity is an oppression. Mariana Katopo proposes to decolonize Asian feminist theology by moving away from the European bourgeois idea of Christianity, which has been imposed on Asian people, and instead turns to the Asian working class as a source of inspiration. So this is from her book. What is the image of Christ which Asian Christian men and women seek to emulate? That of the bourgeois, well-dressed, well-fed, well-educated, well-integrated human being? Or that of the Asian laborer, compassionate and free, talking up the struggle against the oppressive structures? What is the Asian woman's image of herself? Second, by studying Mariana Katopo at Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, we wish to disrupt Indonesian intellectual history as well as feminist genealogy. In Indonesia, although Mariana Katopo's novel Raumanen from 1974 is often discussed in middle school, she was mainly known as a woman novelist and not an anti-colonial thinker in the same way as author Pramudia Anantatur is considered. Also, Mariana Katopo was rarely discussed as a feminist thinker, although she produced her work around the same time as feminists during the New Order, such as Saparinah Sadli and Tuti Herati. But of course, a lot of work still needs to be done regarding Indonesian feminist history and its ruptures. There were many women forgotten, erased from history, while women's struggle in the national imagination is often reduced to the iconic figure of Kartini. who was born in 1879 and died in 1904. In fact, the status of the Javanese princess as the Indonesian icon of women's emancipation, celebrated through the National Kartini Day, shows the interwoven connection between feminism and coloniality in the global South. Kartini was recognized for setting up a school for girls in the colonial period and became known outside Indonesia through her publication of her letters to friends in Europe, collected by J.H. Abendanon. Katopo criticized the reduction of feminism in Indonesia to a single figure. She points out that at the turn of the 20th century, other women had established similar schools in West Java, West Sumatra, and Minahasa, but they did not receive the same credit as Kartini. In addition to the hegemony of Java, the creation of Kartini as an icon was also linked to the Dutch effort to promote Kartini as a representative of their ethical policy. Marianne Katopo writes, Kartini's ideal image of the fully liberated human being was apparently personified in the Dutch men or Dutch women, a mistake which many oppressed people have made when viewing their oppressors. So to conclude, I will offer some reflections. I will stop sharing my screen here. So what can we learn from this new direction of feminism? We are witnessing an exciting time with the emergence of a trans-archipelagic decolonial feminist trajectory in Indonesia. Women work collectively and interrogate the domination of the West or global North, as well as Western Indonesia or Java in the processes of knowledge production. Encounters facilitated by Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, as well as other collectives and networks, show that feminists in the global South acknowledge that feminism is implicated in coloniality, especially in the articulations of universalizing notions of feminism. These encounters also show that global South feminism or global South feminists are not singular, and they continue to find ways of critiquing and dismantling structures of colonial patriarchal oppression. Based on my engagement with feminists across the archipelago, I am proposing a feminist paradigm that is centered on other resistors. Other resistors is a term that I borrow from Maria Lugones in her writing about decolonial feminism. She mentions the importance of learning from other women who resist coloniality in different contexts of oppression. By centering other resistors, in my case, Rode Wanimbo, Septina Lion, Elstine Gerike Katmo, Marianne Katopo, all these women that I have learned from, we make an effort to decenter our own feminism. We look at our feminism with a critical gaze and humility to be able to truly listen from other resistors whose articulations of resistance are shaped by specific conditions based on geographical locations, culture, class, religion, or adat, traditional customs. In this lecture, I hope I have underlined the importance of the question of who to listen to. We need to decenter the global North as the primary site of feminist intervention and instead turn to the learning process that takes place in collective movements in the global South. But next, how do we listen? I will end with a provocation that I borrow from Rode Wanimbo. So in our panel on settler colonialism and transnational solidarity at the Etalase Festival, I asked Rode Wanimbo about what feminist solidarity means for her. apparently the answer to that question was not easy at all. She replied instead with another question around our capacity to listen. I'm going to read her response here. Am I able to give my time to listen? And after I listen, am I able to step out of my comfort zone, take the chance to reconstruct my belief in building this network and solidarity? Rodewanimbo's pertinent question, am I really ready to listen, destabilizes the idea of readiness and challenges the imagination of a fixed, stable place of our feminism. Learning from other resistors, which I view as the core of decolonial feminism, is a risky endeavor. It is a delicate process, an experiment that may reveal our vulnerability, our failure, but it is important to keep questioning our position and opening ourselves to critique, reflection, and revision. We are not there yet, but hopefully we are moving together. And that's all for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Intan for this extraordinary presentation. Now we will turn first to Lara Norgaard to start us off with our Q&A with a few questions. I may follow suit. Before we draw additional questions from our audience, at this time I invite those attending to please use the Q&A function of our Zoom webinar to submit any questions at this time. Lara.
Thank you so much, Intan, for this really wonderful presentation. I appreciated so much your historicized approach to feminism in Indonesia today and how you showed the new trajectory of trans-archipelagic decolonial feminism in terms of these different case studies that you presented at the end of your talk, and also in terms of that historical trajectory. I'd like to begin with a question about the framework of internationalism in this new trajectory of feminism in Indonesia and its connection to the history of rupture that you described. So what I'm primarily interested in is how does the trans-archipelagic decolonial feminist trajectory's approach to internationalism relate to the internationalism of Indonesian feminists of the 1950s and early 60s, such as the international work of organizations like Gerwani? Do you see residues of Gerwani's approach to feminism in a transnational sphere in this new direction of feminism? And I'm particularly thinking as well about several keywords that you mentioned during your talk in relation to transnationalism, like third world subjectivity, Nusantara or archipelago, and the global south.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lara, for the question. I think for us, Gerwani was very inspiring, and I guess in a way there has been an effort among this network to tell stories about what happened in the past, especially the leftist women's involvement in the more transnational feminist networks. So for instance, in our Etalase Festival last year, we invited Ita F. Nadia, feminist historian. We are aware that she is doing a research on the transnational feminist practice in the 50s, especially among the leftist women. So she talked about Francisca Fangide, a feminist thinker and activist who, after 65, was exiled, and she couldn't return to Indonesia for many decades. So there has been that, I think within the network, there has been that effort to tell stories of the past. We had a special forum for feminist historians, and we are aware that feminist historians today are making the effort to view the past in a more transnational way. And because we are very inspired by that, we are also trying to do the same thing. So for instance, I view this transnational, this panel about settler colonialism and transnational solidarity as part of the effort. It's probably not enough, but I think we need to talk about settler colonialism in a more transnational way, not as isolated case like settler colonialism in Indonesia or in Canada. I think there should be a more transnational view of this. Why don't we talk about Papua when we talk about settler colonialism, right? So that's a small effort to have a more transnational perspective to be able to respond to the ruptures that I talk about. But of course, as I mentioned, this is really an ongoing project. I mean, it's probably not enough, and there's a lot of humility involved of how everything is still far from what we expect. But yeah, we're moving there.
Thank you so much. I might follow up next with a question regarding current developments within Indonesia itself. I wonder if you might have any thoughts about how the current movement or relocation of the Indonesian capital to Kalimantan out of Java, moving the site beyond the site of the Dutch East Indies' historically colonial capital, might impact in the near future or distant future what you see as a current movement within Indonesia towards a more trans-archipelagic and decolonial kind of convergence of feminist initiatives, cultural experiments, ideas in circulation. Do you anticipate that this relocation may redirect what had been a tendency to privilege what you'd called a more liberal vision for Indonesian feminisms after 1998 and under the Jokowi administration? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the plan to move the Indonesia's capital city, which they will call Nusantara. That's why I mentioned how Nusantara is a highly contested word. Like it's so much co-opted by the state. I think the move is very much driven by the movement. Changing the capital city is driven by capital. It's about finding new resources, new place for extraction, expropriation. So anything that is really driven by capital should be questioned, I think. It may move, it may inspire new collectives. It may decenter, it may help in decentering social justice movements. But I think I'm probably a bit too bleak, but I feel that everything that is moved by capital in Indonesia it ends up in a rather sanitized space, like feminism, neoliberal feminism that I talked about. So now we have more articulations of feminism, but they are all about, my individual success, breaking the glass ceiling, and so on. And these narratives are really foregrounded or as something normal. And back then, perhaps in the 90s, it wasn't seen as something, very normal to achieve success that way. But now it's really part of the regime, right? So I think there may be some good things coming up based on decentralization, but we really need to be aware of what moves it. We really need to be aware of cooptation as well.
Thank you. Laura, I think you may have a follow-up question.
Yes, I do. I would like to ask a question that relates to your own work in literary spheres. And I know that you did not want to give an overview of the Indonesian literary landscape, but I'm curious about how your work, for example, with the Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, and also your networking with other resistors. You're building these anti-hegemonic networks across the archipelago and beyond. How has that affected your own practice as a writer or your perspective on the project of writing fiction?
Yeah. Okay. I think I feel that now I have a community to talk to share my ideas, and a community to support. And I'm, I talked about Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan, but really Sekolah Pemikiran Perempuan is part of the larger network. We are really connected to, let's say, Ruang Perempuan dan Tulisan, or the women, the room for women and writing. Sorry if the translation is not very exact, but they have this project of reading women writers from the past generation, like Suwarsi Joyo Puspito, Rukia, and all these women who are forgotten and erased. And they actually just produced a book about it after many years. So we are closely connected to this collective. We are connected to the Perkawanan Perempuan Menulis, or the Women Writers Collective, which is the trans-archipelagic network of women writers. They meet mostly virtually. So I find that in terms of Indonesian literary sphere, it is a sphere that's, in addition to being patriarchal, it has it is also very Java-centric, and we are dealing with the questions of gatekeepers who decide writers to talk about, who decides the discourse and so on. And I feel that women should create a network. They should unite. And our connection with Ruang Perempuan dan Tulisan, Perkawanan Perempuan Menulis, I feel that it's a space for us to exchange ideas. We might not be able to sort of create intervention in terms of gatekeeping. I mean, perhaps there are not many of us who are part of the, let's say, the Jakarta Arts Council, who have the power to say, who's who in the literary world. But we are sort of creating a safe space for women writers. And I must say, I should also acknowledge my privilege as someone whose work has been translated, and I do have some, not much, but some limited access to networks in Indonesia and transnational networks, and I really think that I should use this privilege to expand, to amplify women's voices, and I tried to do this when I edited this chapbook, Indonesian Women's Poets, with Tilted Axis Press. It's part of their Translating Feminism project. But I think the moral of this story for all women writers out there: unite. You're not just this. We are all introverts. All writers are probably introverts, but we should be part of the network. That way, we will become stronger.
Thank you so much. I think at this juncture, we'll start to draw from some of the questions that have been supplied by our attendees of this call. I'm going to begin with one from Ari Ambarwati, who's a lecturer at the University of Islam Malang, who wanted to ask you about how the feminist movement in Indonesia could potentially overcome current problems with sectarianism in Indonesia today. And Ari cites, in effect, the rise of political tensions associated with identity politics since 2014. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ibu Ari Ambarwati. So identity politics here, of course, you know, a feminist collective is also another form of identity politics, right? But I think when we talk about identity politics in Indonesia, there's this, the general assumption is that it leads to, it refers to the Islamic conservative movement and the ultra-nationalist articulations. I think the latest, I think it's an ongoing tension. And it, I don't know, I feel like there's the whole narrative, especially in the center, you know, like Jakarta or Java or West Java, East Java, Central Java. There's a narrative that circulates among us that views the Islamic conservatism as the enemy. And how, you know, we should build our strategy around this. But that is I mean, I'm not saying that Islamic conservatism is not worrying, and we should definitely think about it, especially because, you know, the expressions of anti-LGBTQ individuals and groups, we should definitely take it seriously. But I am just saying, if we apply this trans-archipelagic decolonial frame, what really matters in Java is probably not the biggest concern in another place. And I'm not saying that that this is not important. So that's one thing. Another thing, I'm just going to take notes so that I won't forget. I'm going to talk about sexual violence bill, but. When you talk to feminists from Sumba, from Eastern Nusa Tenggara, for instance, what is really pressing there is the you know, the clarity in terms of sexual violence bill, which is now law, because of the practice of kawin tangkap, or women being kidnapped and forced into marriage. That is a major issue. If you talk to any feminist from Sumba, that is their big concern. And if you talk to feminists from West Papua, like Elstineke Rike Katmo, it is about the question of settler colonialism, right? So in each regions, there are major concerns. It doesn't mean that they deprioritize other issues, but definitely this Islamic conservatism is, what is the implication if we see this Islamic conservatism as one issue among many issues that feminists have to deal with and not the center, right? And another thing that I would like to talk about is that this is an ongoing contestation. So in a way, I really don't want to phrase this as we and them, but the latest sexual violence, anti-sexual violence law demonstrates that people who do not support this law, meaning people, the Conservative Party, PKS, the Prosperous Justice Party, who views the law as supporting sex outside marriage, and therefore they are the only party that didn't support the law. They are not really, you know, winning, right? Because the bill was passed into law. So I am I'm not saying that, conservative women in the conservative groups will stop and then they will say, oh, okay, let's accept. I'm not saying that, but definitely we are, the tension is ongoing, and it's not like it's not like the more secular or the Islamic feminists are on the loose. It's really an ongoing struggle.
Thank you so much. And I would like to pick up on a question from the chat from an anonymous attendee who asks, as you have mentioned, the new trajectory should decenter Western Indonesian feminists to listen to the less heard collective feminists. How do you think we'll be able to support Eastern Indonesian feminists, especially Western Papuans, when this is still majorly ignored by those who hold power? And those who also, some who might actually side with that powerful regime due to neoliberalism. And I would also be curious to hear, when thinking about West Papua, are there also alliances between Nusantara feminisms and developments beyond Indonesia, for example, across the historically contested borders in East Timor? And thinking about the material realities of separatist movements in relation to the discourse that you've brought to the table today.
Yeah. How we can support Eastern Indonesian feminists, especially West Papuans. I think it's really, that's why I think it's really important to decenter our feminism. The problem in the past, it's not that I've mentioned that the pluralist movement has emerged, especially in the 90s, 2000, but often the relation between center and periphery, forgive me for this 70s kind of language, but between center, Jakarta, Java as the center of power and access and so on, and other regions, especially in Eastern Indonesia, it has often been expressed in a pusat daerah kind of, in a center and periphery relation that maintains the old way of thinking, like a more sort of sanitized multicultural way, but it's still centered in it doesn't disrupt the center. So for instance, once I listened to a discussion where some of the older generation of NGO feminists share their experience, and they said, okay, yes, we should really strengthen our network in outside Java, and therefore we can disseminate our ideas. So there's still this idea that the places like Eastern Indonesia are the places to disseminate your ideas. You just transport your ideas there, which I think that's a problematic way of looking at pluralism. It doesn't decenter everything. So perhaps what I'm doing today is still very much centralized me as the Java based feminist. But we are really trying to tell more stories, to present more platforms, and perhaps to ask people to organize the events. So for instance, in Etalase Festival last year, we asked Marta Hebi, who's from Sumba, a feminist from Sumba, to co-create her event with Mama Salome Rambu Iru, who's a feminist activist in Sumba. And then they decided the format of the event and what they wanted to talk about. And of course, they wanted to talk about kawin tangkap, or the abduction of women. So I guess, the first thing you need to do is to decenter your feminism. It's to listen, and to listen is not a very easy practice. That's why what Rode Wanimbo mentioned, we should see her as a woman to listen to, a woman we learn from. It's not listening is not something we can take for granted. It needs effort, and probably we are not there yet. I'm sorry, does that answer your question, or is there anything I haven't answered? Okay.
Thank you so much. We have a number of additional questions from the chat now. I'm going to draw one from Laylatul Fitriya, who asks about, who would ask you to comment a little bit more on how you see notions of agency within this framework of archipelagic decolonial feminisms. I might append to that an additional question posed by an anonymous attendee who asks about the regeneration of the feminist movement in Indonesia, and suggests that, it seems like a question that's also in and of itself something of a provocation. Do we still have, the questioner asks, something like a feminist movement if activists involved are circumscribed, are limited in scope, if it is engaged in through unofficial channels and unsystematic ways? How do you see Indonesian feminisms or Nusantara feminisms in this vein regenerating itself?
Yeah, maybe the first question about agents, the notion of agency within the framework of archipelagic decolonial feminism. Thank you so much, Mbak Laylatul Fitriya. We also invited Mbak Laylatul Fitriya in our Etalasu Festival to deconstruct the word Islam. So thank you. We have this another feminist theologian here, in addition to Mariana Katopo who I talked about. The notion of agency, I think we tend to understand the notion of agency from a very, it's not something that we dismantle a lot, and sometimes we see it from a Western perspective. So agency in the neoliberal frame means that you are capable of breaking the glass ceiling and making all those entrepreneurial endeavors, becoming a strong woman, whatever. But what I think the feminist thinking like Saba Mahmood is very, very important here to question the notion of agency and really dismantle it. So Saba Mahmood talks about how, rather than seeing agency as subordination, resistance to subordination in a Western way, we should probably locate agency within structures that the women inhabit. So an agency of someone who lives in a pesantren or who lives in an Islamic boarding school somewhere in Indonesia is probably going to be different. And so agency is something that we should also decolonize, and we should move away from the universalizing way of seeing it, because when I look at agency based on my own experience, I would probably see that my act of writing is a form of agency. The ability to speak here in this forum, that's agency. But for another woman, it's going to be completely different, and we might see that woman's agency in a more not as an agency at all. So that's why we really need to undo our way of thinking regarding agency. I think that's part of decolonial feminism. And yeah, I'm very much influenced by Saba Mahmood in this case. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Mbak Laili. But what's the question about regeneration? Sorry.
The second question was submitted by an anonymous attendee who really asked a question in a fairly provocative manner, wondering if we can even say in Indonesia that Indonesians can really claim to have feminist movement across the archipelago, given that most activists involved are engaging in informal ways. They're circumscribed and limited in number. The movement is unofficial across its many variations. How might you speak to the regeneration of this potentially new vein of feminism in Indonesia as in its decolonial and trans-archipelagic form?
Yeah. So I think, well, I guess my question is, if everyone is going institutional, what would be the consequences, right? So, I've talked about Saparina Sadli as an example of institutional, feminist. She really works within the structure. If there was no Saparina Sadli, we wouldn't have had we wouldn't have achieved some important milestones with Komnas Perempuan, or the National Commission on Violence Against Women. So women who work within institutions, within the system, are definitely important. And I am not saying that they don't exist. In fact, the victory of sexual anti-sexual violence bill or law was precisely the victory of women who work closely within institutions. They really spent so much time negotiating with people on top. So it was a long struggle within the institutional level. So we have seen outcomes in that area. And what I'm concerned of is the connection that we are making in, I think, being informal, being, we call it sekolah liar, like in the past, in Indonesian history, people created like a wild school, not institutionalized. I think it's very important to be outside of the system, to be able to propose a critique of the institution, a critique of institutional feminists. And I think without these different trajectories of feminism, I think feminism will remain singular and sort of universalized, and that is we have seen what happened to white feminism, I guess. I think what we need is more platforms and more voices. I think, I think the institutional feminism will continue working in their way, and they're going to continue to make progress. But all these little fights within the non-informal levels, making connections, I think it's important to maintain our critical, radical edges. We need those spaces as well.
Thank you so much. I hope that you don't mind that we're interested in posing one final question, if at all possible. Laura will be drawing from the chat.
Yes, thank you for taking the time to answer this final point. Sarah Garode asks the question, how is disruption of literary form important to disrupting the patriarchal colonial literary hegemony? Can digital modes of literature be used alongside digital solidarity building and activism?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I think you can, but disruption of literary form. I think it's a bit difficult to speak without context, but let me just use the Indonesian context to help me formulate my answer. So the dominant literary form in Indonesia, or at least within the literary circle, what is discussions around what is good literature and so on. That conversation has been dominated by a movement towards the non-political form of writing. So it's like arts for art's sake, but it's really influenced by 1965 actually, because all the leftist artists were, they were imprisoned and they didn't have much space after the New Order. It's really about the victory of the non-leftist ones. It's what we have is that, this thinking that all forms of political art are bad. I think art should be separated from politics, and this, Indonesia has been dominated by this universal, the thinking of universal humanism in literature. So I guess what we are trying to do within the feminist collective is to question that norm and see that, okay, if this is a feminist work, and how, why isn't it good literature? Why did we only talk about all the male authors in Indonesia, and then we ignored the women just because the male critics think that they do not have literary values? For instance, Rukia, the leftist woman forgotten in Indonesian history because we just didn't read her work. Many people say that, oh, it's just too overt, it's just too straightforward, no interesting metaphor. But are we actually reading in a feminist way, or how do we actually read? I think the most important thing within the collectives is to question the literary form. So what is the dominant literary form? How do we ask questions around that? How do we collectively explore ways of reading, ways of thinking of how to approach the text in a colonialist and non-patriarchal way? I think, those ways, those perspectives, rather than the types of literary forms, I think we should work within a larger paradigm. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. Thank you so much for the illuminating presentation. Very grateful to our audience members for submitting their questions as well and amplifying our conversation. I'm also very grateful to Lara Norgaard for joining us and for her assistance with moderating. I hope that you'll all have occasion to join us for future events at through our Asia Center lecture series, including our final event this year, which will be featuring Elsa Clave's presentation on memories of 1965 and 66 in the literary production of Indonesian exiles across Asia. And this will be on May 11th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And perhaps we might resume, if the subject permits, our conversations and exchanges about iconic figures like Francisca Fangidej and the legacy of Gerwani then. Thank you again so much to everyone for joining us despite the time difference. And have a good morning or a good evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.